Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As Secretary of State Rex Tillerson meets with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Russia to talk about the war in Syria and other issues, we spend the hour with a longtime investigative journalist, Allan Nairn. For decades, Allan has covered the impact of U.S. foreign policy across the globe in East Timor, Guatemala, El Salvador, Indonesia, as well as other countries. I spoke to Allan Nairn Monday, and we discussed the escalation of U.S. military operations across the Middle East, as well as the unique danger Trump poses both abroad and at home. I began by asking Allan Nairn about last week's U.S. attack on a Syrian airbase.
It was an attack on an old U.S. partner, old U.S. torture partner, Assad. The chemical attack was a monstrous atrocity, but it wasn't the most monstrous atrocity that was done in Syria probably that week or that month. The Assad regime routinely massacres civilians using conventional weapons. And also the forces backed by the Gulf states and Turkey of NATO, the Gulf states' U.S. allies, for a number of years were also using tactics that involved attacks on civilians, and some of them ended up morphing into ISIS. This particular attack on the Syrian airfield I don't think is going to save any lives in Syria in terms of its effect on the conflict. It may save Trump to a certain extent politically. It was mainly an act of political theater. The U.S. establishment is an organism, and that organism, in an important respect, has a temperament that is similar to that of Trump. It gets satisfaction from displays of aggression. And if you look at the press coverage, you see that this attack has made them feel good, has made them feel better about themselves as leaders of the United States establishment. But it's not saving lives in Syria. In fact, this particular U.S. attack was probably not the most deadly attack in Syria that the U.S. staged that week, that the U.S. staged last week. Although many people were calling for the U.S. to do this air attack on Syria, many apparently didn't realize that the U.S. was already bombing Syria. In Syria and in Iraq, just over the recent weeks and months, U.S. air attacks have hit mosques, schools, apartment complexes, and killed many, many hundreds of civilians. So much so that the people who monitor this, like the Air Wars Group, have estimated that the U.S. has now surpassed Russia in its killing of civilians by bombing raids. This was more of a symbolic strike. As to the deeper issue of what can be done to stop this carnage, I'm not a pacifist. I think sometimes, unfortunately, tragically, force is necessary. Even violence is necessary to prevent more violence. If there were a military action that could stop this mass slaughter in Syria, I would support it. But there isn't. Contrary to myth, most decisions regarding foreign policy are not hard, they're easy. They're easy. Don't support the murderers. Don't create a bureaucracy that, in order to survive, has to keep on killing in order to justify its own existence. But occasionally, now and then, you will get a situation where the choices are hard. And that is Syria today, because, in important part because of the inexcusable actions of various outside forces, including the U.S., Russia, Iran, the Gulf states, Turkey. Syria has reached a state of such collapse that there really is no clear immediate way to stop or at the moment even mitigate the mass civilian killing. But although it would be extremely difficult, you can imagine some steps that could be constructive. For example, getting all these various foreign powers out, stopping the influx of arms, even on the deal-making level, which the U.S. establishment likes and which Trump likes, even a deal between the U.S. And Russia, where on the one hand, the U.S. agrees to stop the NATO expansion and the pressure on Russia, which is a violation of the agreement that Bush Sr. made with the Russians, in exchange for Russia cutting loose the Assad regime. Things like this could at least perhaps edge things in the right direction. But more airstrikes will not. The fact that the U.S. bombs hit mosques, hit schools, hit apartment complexes, even in some cases hit wedding parties, such as in one famous massacre carried out by the forces of General Mattis, the Muqarradib wedding massacre, who's now the defense secretary. Within the U.S. system, that was in Iraq, on the border near Syria. Within the U.S. system, those killings of civilians are excused because the U.S. was not targeting those civilians per se. They just happened to be next to the targets, so they died in the explosion. So the U.S. system says it's okay. That makes us morally different from Assad, from ISIS, from the Russians, etc. The Pentagon uses calculations, algorithms, before they make these airstrikes. They calculate how many civilians they predict will die by accident. So in a certain sense, it's an accident. But in another sense, if you were applying domestic criminal law standards, it wouldn't be considered an accident. They could be charged with criminally negligent homicide. They could be charged with various kinds of manslaughter. And they make these calculations, and they say, OK, if we drop this bomb, X number of people will die. It used to be, during the Bush attack on Iraq, that the standard was somewhere in the mid-20s, roughly 25 civilians it would be okay to do an airstrike if it would only kill roughly 25 civilians. Now, the calculations have changed. One thing that Trump, with the support of General Mattis, has done is he's encouraged the Pentagon to say, oh, well, even if it's more than 25, no problem. We will still go ahead with this airstrike. So with those standards, some of which, by the way, were inspired by the Russian example, what the Russians call Grozny rules, just unrestrained bombing.
Investigative journalist Allan Nairn will be back with him in a minute to talk about Iraq, Yemen, the Trump administration, and more. Stay with us.